out. What's going on? We're good to go. Everyone's feeling good and ready? Excellent. In a couple minutes, I'm going to turn off my camera and my sound as well. So you can see the attendee view here. I'm going to turn my camera off. And so can everybody still kind of hear me or no? We can. Okay, perfect. We are about 2 minutes out. Perfect. Jenna, I'm going to ask if you're able to get a timer ready on a cell phone or a device of sorts near you, or just a clock if you've got that.
Sure.
Perfect. And set it for 2 minutes.
Will it be obvious when we're starting and I won't just look startled on the screen?
Once that hits 2 minutes, you'll be live.
Okay. I just started it.
Perfect.
Okay. So you don't have to be nervous. I'll make the mistakes first and then you can all just chill out.
We all make one mistake together in unity.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can make as many. Like, let me know. I will sign on to all of them.
Yeah.
If you just saw that pop-up message, that's my advisor.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session exploring the intersectionality of gender, sexual orientation, and Asian identities. My name is Jenna Tenn-Yuk. I use the pronouns she and her, and I'll be moderating our session today. Before we begin our conversation exploring 2S LGBTQ Asian identities, I invite you to think about the land you're on, the histories and stories you learned, the ones you haven't, and the ones that have been silenced. I'm joining you from Toronto, the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas of the Credit. I also want to acknowledge the enduring presence of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples on this land, past and present. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee allied nations to peacefully share, protect, and care for the lands around the Great Lakes. As a racialized settler on Turtle Island, part of my role in reconciliation is to do the work I didn't learn growing up about residential schools, 60s scoop, missing and murdered Indigenous women, land and water defenders, and many more ways colonialism, white supremacy, and systemic racism have impacted and continue to impact Indigenous communities. I also think about the effects of colonialism on my own family's history in Hong Kong and Jamaica, and believing what we call Canada was a better place for them to live. Like many of our Asian families, we had this idea that coming here would give us a better and safer life. But for who, at whose expense, without understanding our role as settlers on this land and benefiting from colonization. As we explore anti-Asian racism and queerness today, this isn't a separate conversation from the legacy of colonization and the history of anti-Black racism. And there are Asian Indigenous queer people and Asian queer Black folks who live at these intersections, as well as a long and shared history of marginalization and racial discrimination with Chinese settlers and First Nations communities. I hope today we can question whose stories are visible and told, who's continue to be shamed and silenced, and how we can build relationships of solidarity with Indigenous communities. I'm glad we're here today to explore our queer Asian stories and take up space, as conversations around gender identity and sexual orientation have often been ignored in Asian communities. That we also get our own panel and aren't just a checkbox as the only queer Asian present. That our voices are important and powerful, especially in the context of anti-Asian racism. With the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes and violence last year, how many of our stories were centered and told? This panel will share our experiences as 2S LGBTQ Asians and explore how universities can create safer spaces for queer Asian students, faculty, and staff. As you hear stories today, we want this forum to be as inclusive and safe as possible. So let's treat everyone with dignity and respect, that we're here to learn, grow, and share, recognize the biases we may have, and be open to learning and asking questions. We'll have a Q&A portion, so we'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to type in your questions, and we hope to get to them. And take care of yourselves and each other during this time. And it's okay to ask for help and support if something does come up to you. So let's get to the panelists. Instead of reading your bios, I'd love for each of you to give a short introduction of who you are. So let's start with Robert.
Hi, I'm Robert Diaz. I'm an associate professor at University of Toronto in the Women and Gender Studies Institute. More importantly, I'm born in the Philippines. I grew up there. I moved to North America when I was 17 to the US first. I lived there for 10 years and then I moved, or 13 years, and I moved to Canada. So I've been in Canada now for 12 years. I identify as bakla, which is a category of queerness and a kind of form of queerness in the Philippines. And I have been really been excited to work and learn from so many queer and trans organizations in the city that work on Asians and Asian communities. And so, yeah, thank you for inviting me. And thank you, Jenna, for that moderating, Tiffany, Christine, and Phoenix for being in this panel, Joselle, Claire, and Noelle for all of your administrative, organizational, and technical work. And yeah, I look forward to speaking.
Thank you, Robert. Tiffany, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi. Yeah, I'm Tiffany Bondoc, and my pronouns are she, her, or they, them. Whichever is totally fine. I'm also identifying as pansexual as well as non-binary, and I am of Filipino and Iraqi descent. Currently, I'm in 4th year in my undergraduate health unit and at St. FX University in Nova Scotia. And with my university's governing body, I have the opportunity to represent equity deserving groups like Asian communities as well as queer communities.
Thank you, Tiffany. Christine.
Hi everyone, my name is Christine Su. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. 大家好，我的名字是许汉庭. I'm a first-generation immigrant settler from Taiwan. I was born in Taiwan and moved here to Canada when I was 9 and had to learn English as a second, or I'd rather say third language. It's such an honor to be here as somebody who wears many different hats in community. I do equity, diversity, and inclusion work as a consultant at large, but I also do a lot of advocacy work in trans and non-binary inclusion, specifically within the sports context in Canada, and sometimes internationally in the US as well. And in this context here today, of course, there's so many things I'm going to be pulling from, but I've also worked in the post-secondary setting context as well. I worked at U of T in many different roles, specifically within the Faculty of Health and Phys Ed, but also more recently in the Sexual Violence Prevention and Support Center as an education coordinator. And I also have stepped foot in Ryerson campus as well as a staff there, doing equity campaigns work with the Students' Union in the past. So I'll be drawing from all of those different experiences here today. And then also sometimes I'm part of the New Queen Collective for the folks who do like to party and be social. So that might also come into the conversation I'll be sharing here today. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Christine. And Phoenix.
Kyugamera, Wanya Nakagawa Phoenix Dani. Hi, I'm Phoenix Nakagawa. I am an Indigenous Amamiryukyuan trans woman who is super happy to be here today with so many amazing people. I'm currently an agroecology student at the University of Manitoba, and hopefully in January, starting my master's degree with an NSERC CGSM in soil science. I would like to acknowledge that I'm on Treaty 1 territory, home of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis. And I'm just super excited for our conversation. I'll add just a tiny bit. I used to be a competitive rower and water polo player, and I've done a lot of advocacy work from Daughters the Vote to just community-oriented sessions. So I'm super excited. Let's get into it.
Oh, thank you all for sharing. I'm so excited to be here with you all. I just wanted to share a bit more about myself. Again, my name is Jenna. I use the pronouns she and her, and I'm a writer, speaker, and facilitator. And I'm really passionate about helping people find and speak their voices because I was so silent in my own story. I grew up in predominantly white, evangelical Christian communities. So I know a lot about holding, navigating, and trying to make sense of, my multiple identities. And this has led me to anti-racism and equity work and using storytelling as a tool to help us understand ourselves and the world around us. And, if younger, closeted university Jenna could witness a panel like this, that would be amazing. So thank you all for sharing. And let's get into our first question to get to know you a bit more. So the first question is, what was your experience growing up queer and Asian? And Tiffany, would you be able to start us off? Tiffany, I think you may be on mute.
Okay, I'm good now. So similar to you, Jenna, I've grown up with like a very similar experience where I've lived in like white communities most of my life. It's really hard to find who I was and where I was, sort of thing, especially since I didn't really look very Asian. I didn't qualify as it, and especially going into high school where I was in a predominantly Filipino high school and I didn't fit in there either because I didn't really look like it. I'm sure the hair dye doesn't really help either, but that's besides the point. And growing up queer, when it came to my personal experiences and my family, they definitely had their own views on it, especially with the intersections with religion and like their culture and how they were raised to think that like queer people just didn't exist outside of like media, and it was just used as like a source of comedy. And so I've always brought it up to my mom about like, what is the possibility of me being gay? And they're like, it's just not a possibility for me. Like it wouldn't happen. And that's how I've sort of like come to like going into university. I've sort of like found myself a little bit more and discovered some things and really just found ways to accept who I was considering my past.
Thank you for sharing, Tiffany, that navigating where do you fit, being enough of this or not. Christine, can you answer that question too?
Sure. I grew up looking very different. Like my gender expression has been very fluid, especially being non-binary and gender fluid, and also identifying as woman at the same time. It really comes down to like, at times when I grow my hair out, my mom's like, "Oh my God, you're straight again." But then I cut my hair and she's like, oh my God, you want to be a man? And I'm like, no, neither. What's happening? So growing up queer, coming out the first time was I was in university when I came out as gay, and then started doing all of this inclusion work as well, anti-oppression, anti-racism work. And then I set foot into my mid-20s and came out as non-binary. And, that's something that my family is still grappling with. I'm trying to find language, especially in Mandarin, to be able to even explain what that means is I'd say quite difficult. And, sometimes moving in and out of healing community spaces, I can, recognize that when you don't have language to talk about who you are, that can become traumatic. So I'd say that growing up, I had gay stamped on my forehead. And so it wasn't a surprise when I came out, but it definitely was. The environment I came out into was very hostile. So that took a long time to heal from. And, I'm really lucky to say that my parents are really receptive and accepting now. They've come around. I've brought multiple partners to my family, not at the same time, because that's also a whole other can of worms. But certainly my family is very accepting now, at least with my parents. My sister's very different from who I am. But yeah, I'd say just finding language to even speak to who I am was really hard to grapple with. And I'm still kind of in the process of doing that as well, searching for even Taiwanese representation, what that means. And I know the work there, LGBT movement there is different. And it was funny, and on this is that my mom has come around and even said hey, maybe you can take your work here and bring it to Taiwan, which is so lovely to hear. Except I had to say, I've lost touch with my mother tongue. So that makes it harder to even be able to grapple with what it would sound like, feel like doing that work in Taiwan, because it's almost like a loss of identity in that sense of erasure growing up here in Canada. So yeah, so that's definitely something that's ongoing in terms of the healing and reclaiming of identity work that is underway. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Christine. Yeah, what does it look to heal and reclaim, to find language, the fluidity of identity? I feel like these are all questions we all wrestle with, and the complexities of exploring these different parts of ourselves. Thank you, Christine. Phoenix.
Yeah, for sure. Within my personal family, I have had the absolute privilege of having members completely accept me for who I am. And honestly, it was kind of shocking how much they didn't care, to be honest. Especially my Amami side, they just weren't even shocked. They just went, cool, can you still farm? You had to go, yeah, and it was done. That was the conversation. So I've had immense privilege in that. My white side is a whole nother thing, but we're not even gonna touch that. But it's really the environment, as with Tiffany and Christine, it's really the environment that I've been in. So I've been in competitive sport for most of my life. And there I've experienced a lot of physical and sexual abuse. And I really don't know a lot of queer folks and women who haven't experienced that. And I can see Christine nodding her head going yeah, it's absolutely heartbreaking. And it really does take time to recover from that. But I also have this thing that I've noticed, which is whenever you're Asian and queer Asian or Black and queer, people don't care about you. So even if you report stuff, even if you state stuff, they'll ignore it because you're not desired to be there, to be honest. And another really strange thing is that even within our Japanese community, our peoples aren't recognized by the Japanese government. We're recognized by the UN, but not the Japanese government. And so my father, my sister, and I all face discrimination by the Japanese community because they are not comfortable with the fact that we're actually the Shimanchu, that's how you say, islander and the endangered language, which I'm hoping to learn, which I introduced myself with, and I hope I did justice to my grandparents. So I think I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you for sharing so much, Phoenix. Appreciate it. Robert.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by hearing everyone's story, right? Because I have kind of the obverse story. Like I said, I moved to the States until I was 17. So I actually came out to myself and to others, right? As queer, or like not queer, but but like someone who's not normative, when I was 11, right? And so I went to an all-boys school, Jesuit school in the Philippines, a Catholic school. And it was really interesting. I think for many Filipinos, like there's multiple, like coming out is actually a complicated thing because there are multiple versions of it. You come out to like, it's kind of like there's a coming out that's subtle where your family's like, where's your friend? That friend that you keep bringing up, and they're like, oh, So and then like your friends we really like your friends, but then they all have to be gay, but no one's saying they're gay, right? Like, so it's kind of So I think for me the coming out process has often been connected to like different patterns of movement. So in the Philippines, it's kind of, I first came out in a church, like in a Catholic church, in the province, not in Manila, and then moving from there to Manila, and then being in an all-boys school where there's so many gay people. They used to do this thing actually called Days with the Lord in this Jesuit school, and the theme of it was like, let down your mask. And by the end of the whole retreat, everyone, like, there's so many gay people. So I think they didn't expect that all these gay people would come out in a Catholic thing. And so then, but I say this because what I find really interesting is moving to the States. Then I actually really didn't fully, I think, and again, this happens to so many Filipinos, but I think there's also for Filipinos who move and then encounter racism or classism or homophobia. I really didn't so there's another coming out, I think, in the US when I moved, realizing that I'm Filipino, that I am Filipino in a white space, in a very particular white space. I am Filipino and queer, and I'm not mapping on to all of those things that people expect in the North American context. Then you have to shift. And then moving to Canada and realizing that, when you are queer in a certain way, as an Asian American, growing up in an Asian American background, which I'm not really because I moved at a certain age, there's a difference with Asian Americans and Filipino Americans and Filipino Canadians and figuring out where do I fit there. So I think for me, there's a multiple kind of level of coming out that is still connected to my migration history, but also like figuring out how those migration histories are like connected to structural things that are often seemingly like unable to capture home, like what home looks like to me or what home feels like to me. And so very different from Christine, it's the opposite experience for me. I think I ended up really holding on to the Philippines, actually, because I think that was the closest way I can see myself as being queer in the way that it's full. And that I think when I teach, I make my students think that, you might presume there are things that are Filipino that are conservative, presume things about the Philippines that are, that are not active, or there's no kind of things there that are happening. But actually, I found that acceptance looks very different. Like there's so many types of acceptance. And in the Philippines, actually, sometimes like, I think there's a kind of care that I don't see in other spaces, And so I think that, yeah, that's kind of like a kind of, so the coming out for me is a continual learning about where my sexuality fits and why sometimes I never feel at home, So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you all for sharing. I love that let down your mask and all these different ways of coming out. As you all shared, Phoenix, your family like didn't care. It wasn't a big deal. And for others, more challenging in perhaps church and family spaces. And that question of, where do I fit? And, I think the next question based off of our conversation is, what does home feel like for you? Where have you experienced that place of home? Often we talk about, maybe we've experienced homophobia, transphobia in the church with families, our Asian communities. But I want to go to where you've experienced that place of home. And Christine, if you can start us off.
I'd say it's just a sense of feeling, really, in terms of finding community. Something I didn't share in terms of like the growing up being queer and Asian is the idea that because there's this need of finding belonging in places where you feel like there isn't a space, I kind of proceeded with like the idea that I just need to create that space. And so very often I think, and then this is like overlapping with my trauma response and also what is healing, which is, you know, I find community, I create the spaces for community. I help nowadays more so, I facilitate those spaces for healing, to talk about the grief that we experience as communities, specifically, sometimes in BIPOC at large, but also even in finding like social spaces like New Hope Queen, where, you know, just staying connected with community, I know for sure is such a rich wealth of access, right? To access any type of connection is really a privilege. So for me to be visible and to be able to speak, even to be here, I've been on so many panels ever since I started coming out, basically. This is like more than a decade of work now at this point. And every single time I do a panel like this, there is this sense of home, right? Like even if it's just to talk about being non-binary or being queer, but to be able to find a space that intersects with the like racial identity and queerness, it's a sense of home. So to be able to talk about this is, to me, that's what feels like home. And obviously, you know, getting my parents up to speed on education, making sure that I'm, you know, educating my nibblings when I can, right? And finding chosen family, honestly, is that sense of home, and creating that sense of home that really does it for me in terms of like, you know, navigating the lack of time really that I have in doing all of this work, because the professional work and personal is oftentimes a full circle, as opposed to just like a Venn diagram. It's a full circle for me. So it's a fleeting one, but it does, in the ways that I've like connected with people, I've been able to access it when I need to, which is such a privilege, and I feel very lucky to be able to do that. Of course, it comes down to being able to like make the effort to keep those connections strong. And a lot of times that could still mean like having to educate people, whether it's like in Asian spaces where having to have those conversations about gender or sexual diversity, right? Like I didn't mention this, but when I was with RAW, Raging Asian Women, playing drums and moving, you know, I had to educate some of my pals, right, about gender, or have those conversations, specifically about like, okay, this is a group that specifically talks about women with an X in the middle, in the word. How do we like unpack that and make sure that it's a safer space for gender diverse folks? And ever since I've left that group, you know, I see that conversation continuing because of the people who are gender diverse in those spaces having those conversations. And it's that constant work of creating that home and co-creating and recreating that space that I see as and feel as a sense of home. Because, you know, as I think Robert, Phoenix, Tiffany, you've all alluded to, like it's the context that we move in and out of, right? That really shifts how we are in relation to one another. And then that sense of safety that I often think about, or lack of safety, is then, you know, it comes up, and how we see as home, what is home shifts. Certainly for me, I won't speak for everyone, but it definitely shifts for me as I continue to do my own healing work, and then also be a witness and support community in that sense. I'll end it there.
Thank you, Christine. Yeah, that needing to create, recreate, co-create, shifting home, creating family, community, that it's work, right? That we can't just, especially as living marginalized identities, you know, we can't just hope proof like the glitter and rainbows are right there. Maybe in some spaces, but even just like a panel like this, that this could feel like home as we're intersecting these identities. Thank you. Phoenix.
Yeah, well, for me, home is where my dad came from one of the southern islands called Tokunoshima, and I absolutely love it there because I feel as though I'm alive there and I'm full there and everything, and it's wonderful. I do know though I can't exactly go back because I am a diaspora. I was born in Canada and I never grew up there. So I don't actually know what Tokunoshima is like. So that idea of home is incredibly difficult to find for me, especially knowing that the Ryukyuans have been under basically a genocide for all these years and enslavement by the Imperial Japanese forces. It makes me realize that things aren't going to be as la-ti-da as I hope them to be. So where I find home a lot of the times are actually with non-dominant culture and Indigenous Asians, especially when they're queer. So in the Filipinos, Uyghur Muslims, Rohingya Muslims, Palestinians, and so many others, Hong Kongers, Taiwanese, many non-dominant culture and Indigenous folks who not only are marginalized because they're Asian, but they're marginalized within their own settler colonialism and their own oppressors. It's a powerful feeling to be. I really feel solidarity with them, and I really feel as though we understand what it's like to have kind of your humanity stripped from you at times. And I will admit, I'm in a very scientific field, and sometimes it's very hard for me to keep trying to show compassion and love and care because so many people around me don't actually do that because they don't think about it. They don't think about like how they're going to affect others. They just think, what is my data? What is my analysis? What is this? And here I am trying to go, let's talk about our hopes, our dreams, our emotions, and our desires, and our feelings. And they're like, what are you doing, Phoenix? So it's a very difficult feeling knowing that something I love can also not be home for me.
That's such a powerful image, Phoenix. Something you love can't be home. And yeah, and even just finding, marginalized communities within non-dominant cultures as that place of home, that kind of like looking at that person and it's like, you get it, you understand these lived realities. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing and keep bringing those feelings into your scientific field. That's awesome. Robert, would you be able to share what home feels like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I really like, Christina and Phoenix beginning us because feeling is so important to how we think about home, right? Like the complexities and the ambivalence. So I feel most at home around women because I grew up, my mother has 12 siblings and then each of them have 4 children. And most of them, so I have like around 58 cousins and all of them I only have 5 male identified cousins. So I grew up in a mostly like female household of matriarchs. And so then I became a feminist. And so I think like for me, home is feeling without like shame or hesitation around the things that make you comfortable and that make you closest to who you become as a person, with some form of freedom, whether it could be a freedom to understand that like, as a male bodied person, right? Like, I need to understand my privilege because I grew up in a family of women and what does it mean for their struggles? And multiple times I've seen them experience intense sexism and then I became a feminist and that is home to me because then whoever I am now is because of them, right? Or it could be a feeling of like, something that was denied to you and then you can finally have it. I was undocumented in the US for 13 years. So I couldn't really go home to the Philippines. I left and I couldn't come back. But to me, and I always thought about it as a kind of a metaphor. Manila always felt to me like a thing that I imagined. It's a thing I obsessed over. It's a thing that I would watch anything about, read anything about. right? But nothing replaces actually getting out of an airport and having the air of Manila hit your face, right? Because then that is home. Like it not in the kind of way that I imagined it. It's actually the way that I deeply felt it. And to just be in that moment and to like it. And I think like that to me is home. And so I think, I mean, Christine's point about solidarity work, you know, that's home to me. And I also think it's the thing that like, because sometimes it's so something, if you want to build a home, you spend too much labor doing, then there are things like disillusionment and sadness and all of those things that come with that. But I think that's home too, right? Like because you built it. So then the labor sometimes backfires in ways that exhausts you. That can be home too. So those are the things that I think about as home.
Thank you, Robert. That labor that exhausts you. I love the image of the air of Manila hitting your face, that it could be just like this moment. It's not necessarily like fully sustaining, that we can move in and out of home and where we feel, that place without shame. Thank you. Tiffany.
Yeah, I kind of agree with everyone else in the sense that like, whenever I talk to someone who is so closely related to my identity, I feel like that's home. That like, this is who I want to talk to. This is who I want to ask to go to coffee and talk all day about our just experiences and our shared experiences on like being queer or being Asian. And that's what I feel right now. Like I haven't felt this in a long time. And once you're talking about it, it was like making me emotional, because like it's hard because when I'm in my university, which is in Nova Scotia, they actually have 87% of the student population is just white. And I could probably count like 5% is Asian. I know it's crazy, Phoenix. I don't know how I do it. But yeah, I look around and I'm like, how is this supposed to be my home where like all these university buildings are based off of like hetero cisgendered like men, and this is just inadvertently telling me like, you don't belong here. Like normally you succeed here. But I think it's like finding those great allies and those great people like within it, especially people who identify like you, who make it a home for me. Like, I live with 6 other girls in Nova Scotia, and all of them are white. Kind of makes sense considering the 87% population, but they do their best to make sure that they reaffirm how I feel and like my experiences as like an Asian person, as a queer person, and those definitely do intersect. And I feel most at home when I'm with them and they're listening to how I feel and like responding to it and doing things about it in the community.
Thank you, Tiffany. Yeah, you bring up that importance of, allies, to have that space to share your feelings, listen, and take action. And yeah, 80%, 87% white population. That's intense. Yeah. Yeah, which leads to my next question about, we're here in a post-secondary context. And when you've had conversations around gender and sexuality in your courses, in the curriculum you're teaching, has that included conversations about Asian queers? Are we included in the coursework? So Phoenix, could you start us off, please?
Well, I'll start us off with saying there's no discussion of queer trans folks in my field. I'm in agriculture. You don't talk about it. I think I am the only trans person in my faculty right now, or at least one of a handful. And so I felt very isolated in my entire career. And I would not actually wish this on anyone else, that isolation, knowing that mostly it's going to be cis hetero men that I'm going to be running into, or cis hetero woman and white. And you're just sitting there going, I really don't have any community here, do I? And knowing that you're not going to have a community. And I think it's incredibly important, especially in my faculty, to talk about queerness and trans identities and two-spirit identities, because most of the time with white supremacy and colonization, food is the first place they attack. and extracting those food resources from you. There's a process called the Haber-Bosch process that we all learn. It's how you extract nitrogen from the air and put it as a fertilizer. And what a lot of people don't discuss is that Haber, one of the guys who made it, is a war criminal. He made chemical warfare for World War I, and he was like an avid promoter of it. But also, he stripped the indigenous food sovereignty from so many people. And he dehumanized people unintentionally. And I work with pesticides, and one of the things you learn is that pesticides have been one of the greatest tools in imperialism and colonization and genocide. And when you start to understand and unravel that history, it makes it more and more important to understand not only queer, trans, this idea of race and racism, as well as disability justice, because all of these are intertwined. And it's a shame to me that many of my fellow colleagues don't actually talk it or touch it because they're afraid to be controversial, unlike me. And yeah, I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you, Phoenix. And what has been your experience having these conversations and being controversial?
Where's that, like, we've grown better, we've got better research ethics and everything. And I'm like, ethics are bound to the institution to protect it, not at all to protect the community. And they don't even touch, many people don't even touch indigenous food sovereignty or indigenous sovereignty in general. And when they do, it's trying to put it into a capitalist concept of putting them into the global market. So it's a really basic conversation with a lot of context in it.
Thank you for sharing, Phoenix. That sounds exhausting. Yeah. Robert, you know, as a professor in gender studies, how have you seen Asian queers included in the curriculum or not? How has that shifted over your years of teaching?
You know, it's really interesting. I mean, first, I just wanted to, shout out for Phoenix's analysis, right? Because what you're bringing is actually good to get into my answer, There are so many joys being, so I am, and people have heard me say this, right? But in a country that has so many Filipino migrants, I am one of like 2 in the entire humanities department in the entire University of Toronto, and actually the only one with tenure, right? And so, so I say this because that brings some joys, right? So what does it mean? 2 years ago, I taught the first graduate class actually, or like one of the, because Bonnie McElney, who's an amazing colleague, has done this work too. And I will get to this in a bit. But, I taught this graduate course and it was a Filipino studies graduate course, but a lot of the material is queer. And I couldn't describe how it felt like to have 16 graduate students, all Filipino, in a class together, and they have never had this experience. Like they've never been in a college classroom where there's 16 of them and they could just share whatever. So there's so much crying or whatever. Like I've never had so much crying in my classroom. I've never had this before. And I was like, whoa. But then I actually but I'm saying this story because then it made me realize like, this is the joy, right? Of being in a position, like actually having a position, being a Filipino scholar who identifies as Filipino, who has the life history that I can speak to someone who perhaps grew up in the Philippines and moved at a later date, or born right in Canada. And like all of us having this different experiences, but what glues us together is that we have the sort of experience of being racialized in Canada in a particular way. And when I said, right, like in a class, like this is how it feels like to be presumed to be a particular class status, particular limit point, right, in this country, they all got, it was like this weird, like, you didn't have to explain it, right? And so then I say that's the joy. But then the hard part is you realize, okay, so I'm queer, I teach queer studies at University of Toronto, but then if I don't do it, then who will, right? And I say this because then the job is like and I think people have done this so well, like Bonnie McElney, other folks have done this really well, right? It's like, then we cannot be siloed as the people that are just doing this work. Like the students should not be responsible for demanding these courses, right? So Phoenix should not be responsible for having to spell out this beautiful like analysis of indigenous studies and like racial capitalism and colonialism. The university should create these spaces, right? And then we are not. Then I don't want it a world where like it's me and Phoenix in one classroom, and then when we're no longer in the classroom, it's done, right? And so I think like that's. So I feel like this is now the task of this forum, if we're doing it, is to not put the burden of the people or on the people who are experiencing this kind of oppression to then state that they need it. It's actually like the opposite, right? You create the space and then like, so why am I the only one like in the University of Toronto, right? Like, and it caused, as a teacher, it actually caused at the very beginning when I first moved to Canada and I started teaching. It's funny, the course would be like, it'll say studies in queer and trans, and then you get into the class and it's all Asian. The material is all like Asian queer, right? And I at first I was like, oh, these students are gonna be like, wait, what? Like what? I thought it was gonna be a like course about everything, like the multiculti model, and then it's all of a sudden like Asia and Trans-Pacific, whatever. And then I started, and then I started asking the students, and after a couple of years, I started asking the students, like, is there like too much Asian content? And they're like, no. Actually, you don't realize we don't see this at all. So for us, it's like you see one after the other course on queer history that's like not about us. So then, like even or like not about my friend, right? Even like students who are not Asian enough, they'll be like, finally, I understand my friend more. Like I can see where they're coming from when they're talking about like being bakla. I can see where they're coming from when pronoun usage, which is such a thing in Canada, which is so important, but some countries like in Mandarin or Filipino or Tagalog, pronoun is not even gendered. So now I get it, right? Like that some Filipinos, when they confuse he or she, they're sometimes not transphobic. It's because the language doesn't allow you to translate that quickly, right? So anyway, I say these things because then I think that like part of the not growing as a teacher and learning so much from your students is the sadness of realizing that the burden is so much on them. Like to have to demand these courses, but also even sometimes not believing they can demand it. I mean, I think that is the hardest thing. When I was trained in ethnic studies in the US, and I constantly say to my students, like, no women's studies department exists, no Asian, like American studies exists, no queer studies department without being fought for. They were not given like by the institution. The students had to like chain themselves to spaces to get them. And so I don't want that burden, right, from my students, right? And so then I think like that's why, in my experience, I think the time is now, right, in this moment of anti-Asian racism to acknowledge that, that this is an intersectional issue and that, being Asian is queer, regardless if you're queer identified or not, actually, in this like landscape of a space that can't even see you. So yeah.
Thank you, Robert. Time is now, being Asian is queer. I love it. Yeah, and that question that I think, all of you kind of have brought up is like, if I don't do it, who will? How exhausting that is to be the only one, to push these conversations, to push these difficult spaces. So Tiffany, I want to start with you, but what can university and colleges do to foster safer spaces and support 2S LGBTQ Asian students, faculty, and staff?
I think to answer this question, I look upon what my university has done well and what also they can be improving. This is just a recent discovery for me, but my university has like a queer clothing store, which is really cool because they collect donated clothes and allow queer or trans students to pick out what they like and without any like cost or judgment. And it's important to really take away those barriers to like allow people to present how they want to be presenting. I also feel like it's really important for staff and students to get cultural competency training, which has been working in my opinion, because like professors aren't educated enough on these things. They're more so just there to do their research, like teach whatever and then like go back home and like not really care about it. So they don't really know where to start. And I think that just gives a really good leeway into it. And it's really important to make sure that like queer Asian students feel welcome in the classroom and have that sort of equitable opportunity of receiving like a higher education. Because I have like I'm in like my health program, and we're talking about health leadership and health inequities. And I had this professor who just wasn't culturally competent enough, which is crazy to me, because in an assignment I was asked, how do you as a leader have white privilege? And I'm like, this question does not apply to me, nor does it apply to all of the other people of color in this room. And like, they were just being very defensive about it. And I spoke up about it, and I was like, this isn't, I would only answer the question as what a white woman would expect from me, sort of thing. And I just feel like when it comes to this sort of thing, we need like mentors, we need staff, we need representation on campus and advisors, so that students have these support systems in order to be empowered and like be a part of leadership positions and governing bodies, so that they have a say in like policies and change that involves them, because they're huge stakeholders. They're a part of the conversation. They have to be, if it's going to be about them. And that's all I really have to say.
Thank you, Tiffany. Yeah, having students have a voice in the, policies and spaces that are impacting them, and have, those mentors, staff representation, even just like Robert shared, of being in a classroom with all Filipinos and having the instructor as well being Filipino too, to be seen and acknowledged in that way. Thank you, Tiffany. And that clothing store swap sounds really, really beautiful. Christine.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Tiffany said. That definitely got me thinking about my experiences as a student, and then also as a student leader, and then as somebody who worked in and out of like student union spaces, and then also working as staff in the last 10 years. In and out. One of the reasons why I'm in and out of the post-secondary institutions is because of needing to strategize, like what I can say to disrupt the spaces, to empower the students who are present. And it requires students to take an interest in wanting to do it. And not just interest, but also the risks that they're willing to take, right? Because ultimately institutions, as much as, the academia is seen as this sort of like unbiased institution, but it really isn't. And I'll say this as somebody who went to University of Toronto, and I also took, SDS courses, and like the university is super, super conservative. And I'm going to say that, I get to say it because I am somebody who gets to move in and out of these spaces. I can tell you that there are staff who can't say this, both within Ryerson and also outside of and within University of Toronto. And there's so many barriers in place, even for staff to just simply exist and connect, let alone the students they have to support, and to be able to provide those mentorship opportunities to ensure that students feel seen. Like when I first started coming out, I went to the gender and sexual diversity office. It was all white folks, cisgender folks, and then after that, it continued. We managed to get some folks in place who are not white. And I was able to connect with those staff. But that's because as a student leader, I knew how important those connections were. And how important it is for me, if I wanted to continue working in post-secondary institutions, that I need to keep these connections alive. And that requires, as was mentioned earlier, like so much work. And I can tell you that I was able to do that because of my trauma response, right? I do not recommend this for most people. And I was able to, learn the coping mechanisms and be able to be connected in community in other ways, to be able to do the work that I do. And so I always want to recognize that, as staff, I'm able to do the work and push the envelope, and advocate for change, not just because I want to, but because I'm supported by people, both by community and also by folks who are not Asian, folks who are not queer. There are tons of folks who I've stayed connected with, who are willing to help out and show up in solidarity. And I think that's a really key aspect to simply existing in university spaces. And so often, and I'm so tired of saying this, but so often our existence is resistance, unfortunately, right? It takes that queer student leader to say, hey, this is not okay, to sit at the faculty council meeting. I was able to do that in my faculty because it was small, to be able to say like, that history of sport course was really problematic. It was super colonial, and even the professor had trouble saying and referencing queer folks. She used the word homosexual. Like, this is not okay, right? Like, and this isn't even that long ago. This was about, I want to say, like, I can't even do math at this point, but long enough, but also short enough, right? Like, that language is out there, and there's just not just lack of representation, but the need to acknowledge that in order to get anyone into any leadership position within that institution, there needs to be interest, and I even say stubbornness, to push through, for folks, especially in academics. You know, all the power to you folks, Phoenix, Tiffany. Like, being a student is so hard, let alone existing in a queer body, and wanting to do queer bodies of work. That is so much work, to have to fight faculty and say, like, this is not okay. To be a professor, a tenured professor, you know, like, all the power to you, Robert. I wish you were there when I was a student, you know, like, it makes it very hard, for folks who are in the middle, which is the staff, to be able to provide support both to, faculty and to students, because, there's also a lack of, I'd say, queer Asian folks in, support spaces and in student services, because of the fact that so many of us didn't have a good experience in university. Why would we want to go back and support, right? And again, for me, it goes back to the fact that I did manage to have and find and create those spaces that worked for me. And it makes me like, it's one of my passions to be able to work with students, to empower students to do the work that I was able to do. That led me to here in terms of my professional career now as a consultant. So there's so many sort of like things that come back to me. Being queer is one thing, being gender diverse and non-binary is a whole other issue as well. Drawing from my most recent experience of working for the Sexual Violence Prevention and Support Center, I had to tell people, like, hey, one, I'm working with the Two-Spirit staff colleague here, and can we just acknowledge, like, Indigenous Peoples Day is happening, Pride is happening, can we make sure we at least mention that we exist? And it took me entering into like a contract work for that person to say, thank you so much, I feel seen for the first time, right? And it just sucks because we're doing gender-based violence support work when so much of transphobia, cissexism, binarism, all of these things show up, and it is part of gender-based violence support and prevention work. You know, that drawing from that experience, you know, it reminded me, like, oh, right, my existence here can only be temporary because that's all the energy I have. And I can also be strategic about, like, really saying the things that other folks might not be able to take the risk to say, because that's their permanent career and professional career. And you know, I think there's always going to be a lack of, and it makes us think about scarcity, or operate in that scarcity mindset. And that goes back to what folks were sharing about, like, the work falls on us, unfortunately. And without us, like, physically being in that space and having these conversations on this panel, these conversations almost always disappear, and they're erased by nature of white supremacy, patriarchy, colonialism, and capitalism, right? It's whoever has the most money to take up space in that academic institution. And you can tell I'm really passionate about this. But it is true. And I'm thinking about a lot of the folks who are harmed, and like that I witnessed harm and also experiencing harm. You know, I'm constantly pulled back by my colleagues at U of T and saying, like, please come back because you say the right things, or you say the things we can't say. And it really is unfortunate, you know, and knowing that the type of trauma that is ongoing for the folks who have to exist there. is really hard. And so that's why a lot of my work, I'll end it on this, a lot of my work is focused on healing and finding healing-centered spaces, because we kind of have to radically accept the fact that these institutions are always going to be run by and will embody white supremacy. I'll end it there.
Thank you, Christine. Yeah, you bring up the harm and trauma, in our communities, and even that the example, like, to at least mention that we exist, that it's like the bare minimum that people think is okay, which obviously isn't. And all the barriers that all these different levels of staff, students, what they can or can't say, and to be able to continue these conversations. And I hope this forum, people are saying what they need to say and aren't afraid to hold back. Phoenix, would love to hear you not holding back.
I hope I'm not. Oh, what was the question again?
How can universities and colleges create safer spaces for queer Asians?
Okay, thank you. I have very bad memory. I think that we have to start to understand that academia in itself began from a very colonial system. Academia was born through colonialism. And one of the things that really disturbs me nowadays is that, in a sense, academia is attempting to co-opt and colonize indigenous knowledges as well, to some extent, which is absolutely disturbing to me. So I hear all these conversations like, we are going to integrate indigenous knowledges into our curriculum and such. And I'm like, do you understand really what you're saying is we're trying to fit your people's ideas into our books and write it down? And that's very disturbing. And especially with languages, it's very disturbing because a lot of linguists take the language, learn an endangered language, write it down, write the phonetics and everything down, and run away and put it into a library for no one to access. Well, my quote is like, give us the money, pay me, and I will learn my language. And there's so many different people out there too. Like my sister, she's a very proud dyslexic Asian woman, and I'm so proud of her. But she's picking up our indigenous language much quicker than I am. And her brain is oriented to it. And she proudly states that. She says, my dyslexia in academia is viewed as like a barrier, but in indigenous language and knowledges and culture, it's a benefit. It's designed to fit that. And so when we talk about academia, we have to understand that academia is still a colonial superpower that actually disrespects a lot of traditional ways of knowledge exchange. So one of the things that I did when I go back to the island is I love to go to the farm with my grandpa. And one of the many things I do is just I sit there and I watch. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't talk. But when he does tell me something, it means that I've earned the right to know that knowledge. A lot of indigenous peoples must know you have to earn the right to have that knowledge. And my grandma told me that back in the day, in the education system, we always go, women must travel 3 hours, 4 hours for water, and they're deprived of education. But when I talked to my grandma, who did that for like an hour and a half back in the day, she said, I talked to my friends, I talked to my family, I talked to my elders, like we did it all together. That's a form of education. That is education in itself. You're learning the wisdoms and knowledges in the community ties. So especially when we talk about that, then we have to, a lot of people always ask, what is education for? But fundamentally, when we look at academia, indigenous knowledges and everything, what is education? And academia frequently, I've noticed, disrespects the process of indigenous knowledge exchange. If I had an elder like an Inuk elder pass me the eyeball of a fish, I am absolutely honored because that is the most nutrient-rich and healthiest part of the fish. And that is love. And that is knowledge transfer. So that's my Lovely controversial statement.
Thank you, Phoenix, for sharing the different forms of education and knowledge and the ways that academia is trying to co-opt and integrate Indigenous knowledges, and that we can't fit our different knowledges and histories and stories neatly into these colonial books and research when they're not meant to exist and live in those ways. And yeah, and I just love that image of you farming with your grandpa and having to earn that right to knowledge when he speaks. Thank you. Robert, could you speak on this topic as well?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to echo Phoenix's comments, but also to think about, if we really have to move away from institutions of higher learning as neoliberal institutions, right? Like that, what I mean by that, institutions that see students as consumers, that see the institution's job as managing people rather than letting people live and learn in the best ways they possibly can about themselves and others. And why do I say this, right? So I think for me, one of the things, I'm really just kind of moved by Christine's comments about staff because, but it's also like, it's about precarity and labor and acknowledging, and it's also about compensation, right? Like, I say this because the institution is a material space. It is about resource inequity, right? It's about, particular kinds of resources are funneled in the name of particular kinds of things. And I think when that happens, the knee-jerk reaction for people who are marginalized to say, where's my pie? Like, where's my piece of the pie, right? But I actually think when we start doing that, we are following a neoliberal model that actually starts asking, where's my pie, rather than who distributes the pieces, who gives you the crumbs. And I always say this in like kind of these settings, right? Like, stop demanding for the crumb. Think about who else is being given the pie and why that pie is being distributed unequally, but also that all of us should deserve to eat, right? And so I say this because, right, I think in the education system we're actually starting to, so in this forum of anti-Asian racism, I really hope that what happens is not just to be included as our goal, right? Like, so to finally have inclusion as our answer is not going to do anything, actually. It might make you feel like I am included, yes, but for whom and to whom and for what purpose, right? And then so I think like in the question, my answer to this question would be like, demand not for yourself, but for your Black colleague, for your Indigenous colleague, for the precarious staff, for the person serving you food, right? For the, like, I say these things because then that is actually what the education system wants us to think. In the neoliberal setting, it wants us to say, right, that I want my turn now. Like, I want my turn, right? Rather than saying, no, all of us didn't get our turn, but also you're deciding which things get to have their turn and then packaging them as diversity, packaging them as inclusion, packaging them as equity, but it never was for us, right? And so what I'm hoping for is in this conversation, everything that was shared so beautifully becomes points of accountability, that we're not just kind of sharing our stories and we're like walking away or as this ableist language, but like moving away, right? Like I think at the end of the day, it's like, I want this to do something, like I wanted to like shift the very ways in which we understand what our role is as students, as teachers, as staff. We're not pawns to a neoliberal institution that gets us against each other. So it's not enough to be included as a queer person. It's actually to say that like, no, I think all things are queer if you actually are in a university that allows you to be, right? So.
Thank you, Robert. That accountability piece, that this isn't just, a one-off of this like queer Asian panel, like what is done with these stories and experiences? Where is the movement and change? And that, question, like, stop trying to go for the crumbs. How can you distribute to Black, Indigenous colleagues, other marginalized communities is so important. Thank you. I feel like when each of you speak, I just want to like snap, like some poetry, just like yes, 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 amazing. So I wanted to end our last question on queer joy. So often we get invited to talk about our pain and our trauma, but there's so much joy existing as our full selves. So what does queer Asian joy, look like for you, feel like, smell like, taste like? And Tiffany, if you can start us off, please.
Yeah, I can start it off. I think that's really hard because it's really easy to focus on the negatives, as like you've said it before, or just like what you want or what you need. I think it would be like queer Asian joy would be with my family, like embracing that sort of culture, not really just like talking about like, because like I've been raised to like fit into this colonialist world where I've been told to forget about my culture and just become normal and do whatever I need to do to succeed in a white man's world. And I think it's to reconnect back to that and just like talk about it. It's really hard for my family to just talk with each other. I don't know if it's just my family or if it's like other Asian families as well. But it's just really talking about my culture, where I came from, and also just educating, like having my family educated on these things, because like it's really hard for them to know about these things since they weren't brought up with any of these sort of concepts. Like they confuse a lot of what the L means, what the G means. Like I identify as pansexual and my mom thinks I'm just like gay. That's it, nothing else. Like she doesn't know about non-binary. I feel like Asian joy would be her wanting to listen and her wanting to learn. And same thing with society as well. Like I don't want it to be the norm for talking about sex and gender as taboo. I want it to be everyone has their own identity. Everyone is accepted, and you don't need to do anything to prove otherwise because you just are. And that's what I think would be joy.
Beautiful, Tiffany. You just are. Thank you. Christine.
Oh, so many thoughts come to mind. Echoing Tiffany's thoughts, like even just starting like talking about it, talking about mental health, talking about our identities and lived experiences, and being able to heal together. Thinking about it makes me think about me witnessing my parents' like experience of racism growing up, and now being like, oh, they're still healing. I've done a lot of healing work. I've tried to reclaim my identity and continue to. And here's my parents continuing to sit with those traumas and not being able to have the language to even talk about it, because they're still operating from the sense of like, we come in with humility, we obey the rules, we follow the rules, we don't disrupt, we don't, like challenge the authority figure, power, all of that. And so that's one part of it. The other part is, of course, I immediately think about New Hope Queen, right? Like the first time I was working the door for the first party, sitting there with the incense going and the lanterns, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I feel like I'm at, I'm in my grandmother's place. Like that was joy. Hearing music that isn't just like North American music, it's Asian music, or it's made by queer Asians. Seeing queer folks who are Asian show up and just be their best selves, like witnessing joy is also joy for me. There's so many aspects to like the idea of joy and experiencing it. I think about Adrienne Maree Brown's work of pleasure activism and how much of that really resonates. Anytime I can experience joy, I think about food. Like Jenna, you mentioned that earlier. I can't remember if it was before we started this, but anytime I've had like a really hard day of doing training on anti-racism in a group of mostly white folks, I step away and I'm like, can I get bubble tea? Like, I need some bubble tea right now in my system to just like reclaim that back, and to just enjoy the food that like I miss so much of. Because that's the only really like real connection that I have, in terms of like my mom's cooking and how that extends back to my grandmother's cooking, and how hard it is to keep that sustainable here because of the lack of access. Or I'd say I'm lucky enough to be able to access like Taiwanese food products. My dad works for TNT. Like I get discounts. Like like I said, very privileged and fortunate. Food is so joyful for me, and I'm so lucky to have generally a positive relationship to food, and grew up with so much food of abundance for myself. And movement, like just being able to dance and move and laugh, just the embodiment of joy in being both queer and Asian. So like I said, in the physical spaces of like Niho Queen or Raw, but also just being surrounded by people who ask questions, who are curious about who we are as people. And talking about this, like, so this is a panel discussion, like who am I more like to say to be here, like any one of the folks who have tuned in to watch this, who are Asian and queer, are more than legitimate and more than valid to be on this panel as well, right? We're here to talk about our lived experiences. And I think having those spaces, finding those spaces to have those conversations is also joy. I'm getting emotional talking about this, but certainly, that's what I think of joy in terms of feeling like, looking like, and I even talked about scent, the incense, that brings me joy, and the music, artistry, folks who create art out of trauma or just create art in general, like all of that is very joyful. And I think I'll leave on this note of like, having access, right, to being in Toronto, being mobile-ish because, COVID, but being able to stay connected is certainly an access point for me to joy. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Christine. I'm imagining you like dancing with like bubble tea in your hand and like incense burning. Awesome. Yeah. Phoenix.
I agree with Christine. Bubble tea is the greatest. Love bubble tea. Well, I'm going to go with one very funny comment, which is A, what gives me queer joy? Beautiful women, working with beautiful women. But B, I think it's when people get to be their authentic selves. And when you're just, like, I agree with Tiffany and Christine, in which there comes a time where you see someone put on a face to protect themselves for so long, and that when they finally recognize they can be safe with you and they take that off, that you just realize, I am so glad I'm alive here today. Like, I'm just glad to be here today. And it's hard sometimes to try to find joy. But for me, I'm not a good singer, but I love singing. I love cooking. I love cleaning. Just finding the joy in that. But also I love when people start to realize that they're safe, they're secure, nothing's going to happen. And if it does, I would take a bullet for them. Like, when they realize that and they go, oh, I'm okay here, you just get that little giddy joy of, oh, I'm so glad I just opened up and was always there. So I guess that's my queer joy.
Thank you, Phoenix. I love that, like taking off that face that, oh, I'm okay here. Just such a beautiful moment and image. And I feel like we should go to like karaoke and have bubble tea. That's what the next queer Asian panel will be. Robert.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, so many things like joy is like, my partner and my dog and life and all that stuff. But also I think, because Christine, you kept mentioning Niho Queen. So I was going to say, like, joy for me is also like learning about joy from how people do joy, like, and like, it's a history of joy. And I wanted to share this image, right? Because I feel like these are all the things that I witnessed of joy in just Toronto, a small space, right? But you could create joy in all the other spaces that you're in. And I just wanted to do a shout out. Like, Niho Queen is on there, but I've been to the Niho Queen's parties and I think it's joyful. Or I've been to art galleries. So I think like one of the things is like, we have, so to me, joy is not only something you feel, but it's also something you learn from and you can document, because then you know how to model it or practice it. And we have a history of joy. We have a very, very long history of joy. So I don't want us to only think about ourselves as like a history of trauma or a history of sadness. We have a history of like a lot of like pleasure and strength and getting together and doing stuff. And so I think if we let ourselves forget that, then we like don't really know what joy is. Like we won't know the full capacity of what joy can do, right? But Christine Yulvin is such an important space to me too, as someone who writes about it but thinks about it. Have many master students actually who've written about it. But that's it. Joy is something we need to document. We need to write about. It needs to be something that people read, learn from, right? So yeah, that's something about it.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, we have a history of joy and pleasure and strength. And Christine, let us know about the next New Ho Queen party. So I want to thank our panel today. What a pleasure. Phoenix, Christine, Robert, Tiffany, thank you for sharing your stories and experiences so openly and honestly. I just really appreciate you and appreciate being here today. And thank you to all of those who joined us. We hope you learned something new or challenged in some way, or just felt seen. And if you are moved by someone's story or experience, I invite you to reach out to the panelists and say thank you. Especially online, we don't get the same audience connection, those asking questions, smiling, clapping, laughing, whatever that may be. So reach out if you can, and thank you for being here and have a wonderful evening. Bye.